From University of Maryland University College, this is Thursday Thoughts with Dr. Alan Drimmer. This series features faculty and friends of UMUC highlighting areas of academic expertise.
Welcome to Thursday Thoughts at University of Maryland University College. I'm Alan Drimmer, Chief Academic Officer at UMUC, and I'm joined today by my friend Brandon Busteed from the Gallup organization. And we'd like to talk about the voice of the student and the voice of alumni. And I will just say that, one of the marvels of higher education is that you have all these smart people who are used to using data. They're making big decisions about students and faculty and programs, and many times they're not using data from students and alumni about their preferences. Now, I know that the Gallup organization has done polling for a long time, and I've always thought about them, from the past, about doing polling in things like public opinion,
right,
political issues. Yeah. But in the last few years, you've been very successful at applying this to higher education, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to do it and focus it on higher education.
Well, thanks. It's a fun question to answer. You're right. Gallup has had a history for 80-some years of unearthing the voice of key constituents, right? And we think about that through the lens of a poll or a survey, and we've been doing that in the U.S. and all around the world. So in many ways, it was a very natural extension for us to take a deeper focus in higher education. Our work largely over the last 5 or 6 years has been about surveying students, currently enrolled students, former students, whether they are graduates or not, right? I mean, you can look at alumni, you can look at those who started and never finished, right, and even getting the understanding of prospective students, right? The kinds of expectations they have for higher education. And so it has been really eye-opening for a number of reasons. One, to your point, I always make this joke. It's a little bit funny, but also sort of true. Higher education has studied everything except itself, right? And so in turning the lens to how do we improve what we're doing in our work of higher education, I think it is critical to have an understanding of the student experience, right? What parts of that really work for them, what don't? Everything from pinch points in how they register for classes or whatever it might be to the meaningful experiences that they take away from it. Here's the point: it becomes very instructive. It's instructive in how we improve practice. And yeah, you can use it to say our alumni are doing better than other alumni, and we want to know what that return on the college investment is. But to me, the most important outcome of a lot of this work has been understanding how we improve this precious thing that we call higher education in America. And I think we've learned a lot through the lens of the voice of students, prospective, right, current, and former.
Right, no, it's very important. But was there something that prompted the organization to move from the social and political to looking at higher education, or was just evolution of the business? What happened?
So that's a good question. Everybody thinks about the Gallup poll because that's kind of the famous branding around it. The interesting thing is we don't really make any money as an organization doing polling. I mean, it's been part of our historic base of what George Gallup was famous for in predicting a presidential election, and we continue to do that work, and we do it through our own funding. I mean, our Gallup daily poll is funded by Gallup. It's not sponsored by another organization. We don't do projects for special interest groups, right? So we don't do work for the Republican or Democratic national committees. It's kind of our own independent work. But a lot of the work we do get paid for is research for employees, organizations that want to understand how their employees are doing. They want to understand how their customers are doing. So I came to Gallup to help build a higher ed practice. So that was a very specific, intentional investment that Gallup wanted to make. And the belief was that education is one of the most precious assets that anybody can have or achieve or attain. And we ought to help educational institutions know better, get the premise right about what people do or don't want, get the understanding right about what the return on investment is from a number of angles, not just financially, but for my overall well-being, my livelihood, certain things like that. So it was a very intentional thing that Gallup wanted to do to build a real practice serving institutions of higher education. But the fundamentals of it are the same. George Gallup used to, he was famous for one of his expressions where he said, if democracy is about the will of the people, somebody ought to find out what that will is. And I think if higher education is about students, then someone ought to find out how they're doing. Right, so that's a very simple, step from George Gallup's kind of original focus on this. Right, so right. I would just say it's been a very natural evolution for us, and we've loved the work that we've been doing.
Right. Could you say a little bit more about you? How did you get involved in this? Because you lead a practice that includes education, I think public sector, government. maybe a fund, nonprofit. I don't know, but a couple
Yeah.
of those things. But what about you? How did you? What brought you to this field? And because now you're totally well known in the field. I mean, people in higher education have heard about this. But what's your story?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think like a lot of us who are still in the field of higher education in some form, we actually never really left, right? So, I had an incredible experience as a student. On my mom's side of the family, I was the first one in the family to get a 4-year degree. My dad's side of the family, but both of them grew up on farms, right? I mean, just education for their children and grandchildren was a hugely important thing. And so when I got to college, it was just something that I wanted to make the most of. I mean, it was part of our family, DNA, that it was really, really important. And so that was part of it. I also had an incredible experience, life-changing experiences with great mentors and professors who supported my development, and had a chance to serve on the board of trustees at my alma mater right after I graduated as a young trustee. And so in many ways I never left. The company I started right after I graduated served higher education around really tricky issues like alcohol abuse prevention, sexual assault prevention, where we did online courses that helped educate students about those kinds of issues and challenges. And so that was my first 11, 12 years out of college. That's what led to the opportunity at Gallup. I've been at Gallup for the last 6 years. So I've done different things in higher ed, but it's all been, consistently higher ed. I've never really left college in certain respects. Yeah,
that's a wonderful story. I didn't know all that.
Yeah, well, I see. Good to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah.
So I want to take you back to, it was probably the first study that really was meaningful for me. It was the Purdue Gallup study. I think it was maybe 2011, 2012. I started to hear about it. I don't recall exactly. But that study, that's an oldie but a goodie. To me, it is very impactful. But could you talk a little bit about that study and and how that's evolved? Because you've continued it and you've built on, I think, some of the insights from that. But I think it's very powerful study.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to that first question you had about higher ed paying attention to critical constituencies, right? Like students and alumni. I mean, the amazing point about the Gallup Purdue Index when we crafted that was that it was the first time ever that anybody had done a large-scale representative study of college graduates in the U.S. And you just pause that for a minute. You go, how could it have been, it was, we first started the data collection in 2013. I think the first report was into 2013, 14. But anyway, it took until 2014, let's say, and the several hundred-year history of higher education in the United States before anybody went out and thought or cared to do a large-scale representative study. And not only did we look at things like what was their personal and household income, I mean, important metrics we understand, we measured the degree to which they're engaged in the work that they do, the quality of the jobs that they had. We also measured their well-being, how they rated and evaluated their lives in different dimensions. And so that, I think, was one of the big breakthrough moments, not just that we did this large representative study, but that the kinds of things we measured weren't just your typical indicators of, did you get a degree? Do you make more money? Right? It got into this, what I would call qualitative evaluation of the other ways in which higher education might have enhanced your life and your work and things like that. So so that was really, a project that now has been done annually every year since. We've had dozens of reports and research papers that have been produced from it. And, we learned really important things. The big breakthrough findings initially were that it's really about, the kinds of experiences you either had or didn't have during your experience in higher education that have profound relationships with your success later in life. And they were things like whether you said your professors cared about you as a person, whether you said you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams. You think about the phrasing these questions, they're pretty powerfully worded, right? And but graduates who strongly agree to those kinds of emotionally supported experiences, or what I call relationship-rich experiences, doubles their odds of being engaged in their work later in life, doubles the odds that they're thriving in their well-being. So these are profound relationships. And it also was linked, and I think this is a very interesting point for an institution like UMUC, it was linked to the relevancy of their education in terms of how they felt it was linked to their work later. So, for example, students who had what I call work-integrated experiences while they were in college, they had a job or an internship, or they applied what they were learning in the classroom, or they worked on a long-term project that took more than a semester to complete. By the way, only a third of college graduates strongly agree to both of those examples. So we could do a lot better. But those who do, doubles their odds of being engaged in their work later, regardless of what that work is. And this isn't just a 1 year out effect. This is 5, 10, 20, 30 years out. So as you think about an institution like UMUC that has been very intentional about designing curriculum around work connectivity, job outcome, work integrated experience as part of that. Those are things that are kind of quintessential in what we've learned in the study as being really powerful indicators of success later in life.
But just to pause on some of the key outcomes from this study.
Yeah.
So what you found was that students who had a very rich personal experience with a faculty member, a mentor, a person.
Any kind of person. Not just faculty, right.
And not just faculty, but somebody in an academic leadership role. It wouldn't be their resident assistant in their dorm, right? It would be somebody, is that right? Or maybe it was, I don't know. But any kind of relationship.
Yep.
And people who worked on something that was applied and relevant to the real world, I guess, that those people ended up having were disproportionately more engaged in their work after they graduated.
Yep.
And had a better, what would you call it, quality of life or a better life?
Sure. They're thriving in their well-being.
Thriving.
They rate their lives higher, right? And that's a pretty important thing. When we look at, some people might write that off and go, oh, big deal. But one of the questions we asked in the survey, I love this question. We asked people to think about their lives on a ladder, 0 to 10 rungs, right? 10 being the best imaginable life, 0 being the worst. We say, where do you rate your life today? And here's the first important point. Whatever you say is your answer. I could pass judgment, right? Oh, I bet Alan's a 6, or no. Whatever you say is the true answer, right? That's the authentic. You can only get that answer from that person, him or herself. And so anyway, that's an example of one of the questions that we asked. So the point is, right, that anybody who had those kinds of experiences we just rattled through doubles their odds of thriving in their well-being. And one of the ways we calculate that thriving and well-being is that life evaluation question. They have better lives. They think of their lives. They evaluate their lives better than the graduates. Keep in mind, everybody in our study were college graduates. So this isn't just an effect of college. There's also that special additive effect of having those important relationship-rich experiences and work-integrated experiences. So if you say, Brandon, what are the secret ingredients of this special thing we call higher ed? I would point you to these aspects. And so the other disappointing part is that there are indeed many graduates who meet the academic requirements to receive a diploma from their institution, who didn't hit the mark on any of these key questions or indicators that we studied. In fact, so we found, we've mentioned 4 or 5 of them, but there were 6 that really jumped out. And of those 6 really important experiences, 24% of all college graduates in the U.S. are a 0 on that 6-question scale. So, which is to say, about a quarter, right, are missing the opportunity, whether they didn't take advantage of these things themselves or the institution didn't do a good job of helping them. So there's a lot of room for improvement on this. But what I also think it says in a very optimistic way is we know a lot about these secret ingredients, and we can do a lot to improve on them, and it doesn't cost. There's not budget answers. They're more about what we value as an institution and what we encourage students to value in terms of making the most of it.
Right. No, it's an amazing. It's just an amazing endeavor that you went through. I saw this. I saw an interview with Mitch Daniels on C-SPAN. They went through and they talked to the presidents of I think all the Big Ten schools, and the interview with Mitch Daniels was fascinating because at the beginning they asked him a very general question about what he was. I think he was rather new at Purdue at that time, and they were asking him what he was trying to do with the school. And he didn't mention the he didn't mention the survey exactly, but what he was we talked about was looking for indicators of success that went beyond iPads or other more mechanical, perfunctory data sets to really having impact with alumni and really making a difference with people's lives. And it seemed like I don't know. Could you tell us a little bit about that story about Mitch Daniels and kind of how he worked with you or you worked with him? But it seemed like he was one of the people really driving some of this work at the beginning.
Absolutely. President Daniels, I think it's very fair to say, incredible thought leader. Right when he first took that job at Purdue, and you remember it because you basically just paraphrase the same kinds of things. But he was well known in the media then because he had staked his pay on performance indicators of alumni and students, on student growth measures and alumni outcomes. And he hadn't quite at the time figured out how he was going to do that, but he had made that commitment.
I see.
And so we got connected to him.
So you were helping to get him paid.
And we got, yeah, exactly. But we connected to him in various ways because he had set up a task force to look at student growth measures and alumni outcome measures. And so I had been called in to talk with their committee about this, and we had this very fascinating conversation about, well, we could measure Purdue students and alumni all day long. But we'll never really know relative to others, right, how you're doing unless we had, and we kind of jokingly said this at the time, unless we had a large nationally representative benchmark. Because we could see great data, but is 75% high or low, or is it average? I mean, that becomes difficult unless you have a benchmark. And I said, well, geez, if we had a large nationally representative study, we could really show Purdue how it compares. And President Daniels said, let's do that. I mean, that was basically where he was in his urgency to lead around this, and it was an amazing set of forces. I mean, there's been an entire village that's helped raise this up. Mitch provided that leadership, and Purdue provided that leadership. We ended up in the initial days getting financial support from the Lumina Foundation to do the study. So Lumina Foundation provided a grant to Purdue. Gallup conducted it. And now the study continues to go forward with support from Strata Education Network. So it's been an amazing collaboration. I mean, think about that. An institutional leader, a university, Gallup, foundation and philanthropy. And it's a great example because I think it took that collaboration to get this kind of thing off the ground. It's not hard, but it's also not simple. And but I have great respect for Mitch's leadership and Purdue's leadership on this, and then all the contributors from Lumina Foundation to Strata and the incredible teams at Gallup have been part of it, because you look at the landscape now, just 4 or 5 years later, and you can see references to findings from that study in almost every university strategic plan. It's been written about widely in the news, not just in the U.S., but around the world. It's one of the most downloaded reports in Gallup history. So you think of all the stuff we put out, there's just an incredible amount of interest around it. And I think it speaks to the power of the student voice, right? Which is kind of the theme of what we're talking to here. When you unearth that, it's really, really valuable.
So way back in 2014, you came out with this study, and you mentioned how some of those findings have been integrated into strategic plans and other sorts of strategy guidance for universities. But what's your feeling about how much more room we have to go? I mean, do you find that universities are really doing enough with some of these findings? And I know you've extended them, but what's been going beyond sort of inclusion in documents? Do you find universities really responding to this in practice and beginning to operationalize some of these findings?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one of the fair answers is not enough and not fast enough. Right? There are examples of individual institutions that we know of, some that we don't know of, I'm sure, that have really, really adopted these kinds of insights in a serious way, where they have completely revolutionized what they're doing from a programmatic perspective. One that we're working with now, but this project started before we were involved. Furman University got a substantial grant from the Duke Endowment Foundation to basically guarantee that all of their students, not just some, this is the real revolutionary idea, all of their students hit the mark on these critical experiences that have been identified by this study.
Right.
And so what I see are universities that can talk about this in pockets. Like, oh yeah, do we have students who have internships? Sure, but if you peel away the layers, it happens for a quarter of the students. And then if you go, well, was it an internship where you were really able to apply what you were learning and you asked some tougher questions? Well, then it gets to a lower percentage. So the honest answer is a lot of universities can point to areas within their institution where they're doing well on some of these metrics. But there's still a long way to go. The flash to bang time of here's some important insights, and then translating that into practice. But I would say there are certainly dozens of institutions that have been making very fast progress on this, and in very real ways. And again, one of the examples I mentioned before is I don't see them spending lots of money to do this. You don't have to build big new buildings and raise bonds, or get a huge donor to make a huge grant or whatever it might be. These are changes in what institutions value. There are changes. I mean, think about this in the incentive structures of higher education. We have a famous expression for how faculty get promoted in higher ed, and we use the expression publish or perish. It's about academic publishing and research. Right. It doesn't say, for example, mentor or meander. But you could draw out of this study that mentoring is one of the single most important ingredients of success for a student, which means, that's a place where you want to encourage faculty and staff to play that kind of role. Well, what does that mean? I mean, have we actually set that expectation? Do we have incentives and rewards around that? Now we're getting into some really gritty issues like tenure. And, so I'm not saying that tenure is something that solves for all this, but I think one of the reasons why you don't see more rapid action around some of these things programmatically is that it does get into some really, very difficult conversations of things like incentive structures and how tenure and promotion works and certain things like that. So, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm optimistic. What I say to most college presidents is, if you look at the national scorecard on these indicators right now, Alan, generally we're lower than we ought to be. Here's the good news, though. There's plenty of room for improvement, and improvement can happen rapidly.
Right.
So one campus that we know of that has been doing this for just 3 years has doubled the percentage of their currently enrolled students who have an internship where they're applying what they're learning in the classroom. They've done that in 18 months. From the year 1 survey to the year 3 survey, 18 months of focused programmatic efforts, and they've doubled that percentage. So the good news I say to institutions who might feel like they're behind the curve on this or haven't even measured these kinds of indicators, if you start measuring them and you start paying attention to them, you can make rapid improvement very quickly.
Right. No, I think, and it's been very inspiring for me personally. I think I could talk about this subject all day long, but one of the things that I think really helps in changing the attitude of universities towards these kinds of outcomes is just being able to refer to the data that you have. I think that's the best way to start a conversation with faculty and with others at a university is to show them what students care about, because
Right.
as I said at the beginning, we all seem so sure of what students want, but we actually don't have great data about what that is, and I think you give us a window into that. I know we have limited time here. I want to shift a little bit to a more recent study that you just did, which is equally exciting, which focuses on relevancy. Could you tell us just briefly what's the focus of that study, what have you learned, and what sort of impact do you think that's going to have?
Yeah, well, probably the most remarkable research initiative I've ever been involved with. I mean, certainly the Gallup Purdue Index would be at the very top of the list. We're probably in the midst of the thing that would be and will be and already is on my top of the list, even beyond that, which is for the last 2 years now, we have been conducting a daily survey, live on the phone, daily survey about higher education. So we're interviewing 350 U.S. adults on a randomly sampled basis every single day. Calculates up to about 10,000 a month, 122,500 a year, under a huge project that we're doing with Strata Education Network. So this is under the banner of the Strata Gallup Education Consumer Survey is what it's labeled as, and we have several reports that have been the basis of this. But anyway, so the source of this relevancy report comes from Education Consumer Survey, which is literally a daily poll of U.S. adults about higher ed. And so what we've learned is that whether your education was relevant, and it was defined in a couple ways. We asked a question about of graduates, whether or not they felt the courses they took are relevant to the job that they're in. I mean, it's a very simple, straightforward question, right? Like, the things you learned in college, is it directly related to the work you're doing now? And then we also asked a broader one around whether or not the things you learned while you were in college are applicable to your day-to-day life. So a slightly broader question, less about work. But on those two questions, we use those two questions to define relevance, right? Was your education relevant? First, not so exciting news is that only 26% of college graduates in the U.S. strongly agreed to both of those questions. So in terms of, again, are there other ways you can define relevance? Sure. But based on how I just phrased those two questions, a quarter of U.S. adults who have experienced higher education strongly agree with that. That said, here's the most important finding. Relevance is a stronger predictor of your feelings that your education was worth the cost, that you felt it was high quality, than any other objective indicator we could test it against. In fact, by 2 or 3 times. So if you say, okay, what if you look at the SAT and ACT scores of students on the incoming side of things? Pales in comparison to relevancy. Same thing with graduation rates, student loan default rates, 10-year alumni earnings 10 years out. All those in comparison to relevancy, they pale in comparison in terms of being predictive of you as a graduate saying, yep, it was worth the cost and I got a high quality experience. So what that says to me is it really opens the door for the value and need of, let's just call it, consumer ratings in higher education. If you think about it, almost every other industry has been transformed by consumer ratings. You think about hospitals and what happened when hospitals started to pay attention to patient satisfaction ratings. You go on and on. Restaurant ratings. I mean, literally every single industry is guided in some part, either in a large part or small part, by consumer ratings, customer experiences. In this case, let's just call it student experiences. So in any event, that really jumped out to us because you start to say, well, what are the ways that you can increase relevancy?
Right.
If colleges and universities want to improve the likelihood that graduates say it was worth it, and I had a high quality experience and all those other things, then we ought to increase relevancy. And I'll just give you one simple example. This speaks to the power of faculty, the power of an individual staff person, and their ability to change somebody's trajectory. If a graduate says that they had at least one person who talked to them about their career while they were enrolled, it buoys their ratings on feeling it was worth the cost, feeling confident they'll get a good job, getting a good job later, right? All those.
So this ties even to
Big
the
time.
Purdue piece where it's having somebody that takes an interest, but here's specifically about careers. That's interesting.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's not just hey Alan, how you doing? But like, what are you thinking about doing? Where are you
Right.
trying to go with this? Just that conversation alone.
Right.
Now it can go beyond that and be much more expansive. But if you think about it, that to me again is very inspiring. Although these percentages are lower
Right.
than we would like them, the news that I have for everybody is that you can move the needle on that kind of metric quickly.
Right.
If you say to people, we value this, and I'd like you at one point in the year to
Right.
make sure that you're asking students about what their career plans or trajectories are.
Right.
Even if you don't think you can give them great advice, have that conversation.
And that's so important because I think many faculty do that. Many faculty do talk to students about their career progression and their goals, but they do it almost as an add-on. Their focus is really, I have learning objectives or I have competencies and I have to get through that.
Yeah.
And I'll talk to you about that because, I care. But that's almost a diversion or, tertiary. And I think it's so interesting that it turns out to be one of the biggest drivers of value.
Right.
I think higher education institutions also they're caught. They're so focused on learning outcomes that the sometimes student satisfaction is seen as less important. But again, you bring this balance, which I think is so important in helping people see what people want, what people care about, and show that it has an impact. My gosh, on
Yes.
how they live their lives and what they become.
And it's interesting, we always quibble with these definitions just because that's what we do. But when you say something like satisfaction, one distinction I want to make is that this is not just about making students happy.
Right.
Like the lazy rivers and the fancy accoutrements that might be added to campus. We find no relationship with the style of buildings that are on a campus. I mean, this is about the relationship-rich interactions they have. And when we ask of the graduates who strongly agree that their professors cared about them as a person, if you do qualitative interviews and you ask people like, well, what was it that made you feel that way? One of the most common things they say is that this is how low the bar is where it starts. The most common thing they say is, they knew my name. And they'll go on, right? Then they'll say, and they got to know me and they asked me what I want to do. They pushed me. They made me work hard. So it gets more involved. But it starts with, again, something as basic as they knew my name. They had at least one conversation with me about my career, right? So I encourage everybody to kind of use that as a starting point. We can all do this. We all have a role in improving these outcomes, including students. So if you're somebody who's currently enrolled in higher education and you hear this kind of input, I have advice, making sure you seek out classes that have work integrated, curriculum, right? If you're in a job while you're studying, which many UMUC students are, think about how you can extract what you're learning in your job and connect it to what you're learning in your, more traditional academic material. That's something a student can own too, and a faculty member could say, Alan, what do you do for work? Oh, you do that. Well, let's talk about how my supply chain management course applies to, whatever the example might be. So the good news is this is a role we all have a hand in, every individual staff and faculty member, and every student in terms of how we can make the most out of this precious thing we call higher education.
Right. Well, look, your insights, they're very important for us as an institution, as University of Maryland University College, but I think for all of higher education. We could talk about this a long, long time, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to do that. But thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on Thursday Thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Thanks, everybody who joined.
Thanks for watching Thursday Thoughts with Dr. Alan Drimmer. This has been a production of University of Maryland University College.